Placing a camera inside a coffin for a scientific experiment, a college student and a priest were horrified to discover something so terrifying that they had to call the police. Father Jonah sat at his desk, fingers drumming lightly on the worn oak surface. His thoughts raced as he replayed the unsettling video in his mind over and over again. The old camera, nestled inside Mr. Hawkins's coffin, should have recorded stillness, a silent testament to the experiment's failure or success. Instead, it had captured shadows, moving, writhing. The static flickers and soft distortions seemed almost alive. "It doesn't make sense," Jonah murmured to himself, his voice heavy with both curiosity and unease. He glanced at the clock, its ticking loud in the empty room. Midnight was nearing, and the town of Elmsworth lay quiet, cloaked in its usual calm. But Jonah's mind churned with restlessness. He couldn't let it go. Not without answers. Leaning back, he grabbed his cell phone and scrolled to Dahlia's number. She was the brightest mind he knew when it came to technology, though her bluntness and cynicism were often difficult to handle. Still, if anyone could unravel this mystery, it was her. The phone buzzed twice before her voice cut through, casual and slightly distracted.
"Father Jonah, you realize it's past 11, right?"
"Yeah, I know. I wouldn't call this late if it wasn't important." His words came fast, tinged with an urgency he couldn't mask. "I need your help with something. Something strange." There was a pause.
"Strange like the time you tried to convince me your church bell was haunted? Or strange like actually worth my time?"
"Neither," he replied, a faint edge of exasperation in his tone. "This is real, Dahlia. There's something wrong with the footage we took from Mr. Hawkins's grave. Can you come by tomorrow to take a look?" She sighed audibly.
"Fine. But this better not involve ghosts or whatever supernatural junk you usually get excited about."
Jonah hung up, feeling a small sense of relief. Dahlia's skepticism was irritating but grounding. If there was a rational explanation, she'd find it. And if not, well, he'd cross that bridge when he got to it. The next day, Dahlia arrived at the church carrying her ever-present laptop and a cup of coffee so large it could barely fit in her hand. Her dark hair was pulled into a haphazard ponytail, and she wore the perpetually tired look of someone juggling finals and a part-time job. "All right, let's see it," she said, setting her gear down on the desk. Her tone was impatient, but her eyes betrayed a spark of curiosity. Jonah queued up the video, the grainy black and white footage playing on the small monitor. For a while, there was nothing but stillness. The closed coffin, the faint hum of the camera, and the oppressive silence of the graveyard at night. Then the shadows began to shift. Dahlia leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "Is that interference? Or, wait, play that part again." Jonah rewound the clip, and this time they both watched intently as a faint, almost imperceptible shape slid across the frame, like smoke curling in the wind. Dahlia's fingers flew across her laptop as she started analyzing the recording. "It's picking up a low-frequency signal," she muttered after a moment. "Definitely not static. It's weirdly deliberate, like it's coming from a device, not the environment." Jonah frowned. "But why would there be any signal like that in a graveyard? There's no equipment, no towers nearby." "That's what I'm gonna figure out," Dahlia replied, her tone sharp with focus. She worked in silence for several minutes, her coffee untouched as she cross-referenced frequencies and analyzed the data. Finally, she leaned back, a strange expression on her face. "This signal doesn't belong here," she said quietly. "It's too precise. It's almost like someone set it up on purpose." The weight of her words hung in the air. Jonah felt a chill run down his spine. If Dahlia was right, then this was no ordinary interference. Someone, or something, was tampering with the experiment. Jonah couldn't shake the unease that clung to him as he locked the church doors for the night. The thought of the low-frequency signal, deliberate and alien to the quiet graveyard, gnawed at his mind. He had spent years delivering sermons about faith and the unseen, but tonight the unknown felt disturbingly real and uncomfortably close. Dahlia's discovery played on repeat in his head. If the signal was purposeful, then someone had a reason to send it. The possibilities twisted his stomach. Was it a prank? Some secret project by the town's utility workers? Or was it tied to something far more sinister? He had barely slept when morning came. By the time Dahlia arrived, her usual no-nonsense energy was heightened by curiosity. She didn't wait for coffee this time. "We need better equipment," she announced, dropping a small duffel bag onto the desk with a thud. "The signal's not enough to work with. It's like hearing half a conversation. We need to figure out what's actually causing it." Jonah nodded, though his enthusiasm was tempered by a growing dread. The graveyard, once a place of solemn reflection, now seemed to pulse with invisible currents of something unnatural. By dusk, the pair stood again among the weathered headstones, armed with a set of high-sensitivity microphones and a digital camera rig Dahlia had rigged together from her college lab. Jonah carried the heavier recorder, its metal casing cold in his hands as the last light faded. They positioned their equipment near Mr. Hawkins's grave. Dahlia adjusted the microphone stands with precision, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jonah stood nearby, silent, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. As the night deepened, the first hum reached their ears, soft, almost imperceptible. Dahlia's eyes snapped toward the monitor, her fingers flying over the controls. "There it is again," she murmured. The lines on her screen danced with activity. "It's not natural, that's for sure." The sound grew louder, a mechanical rhythm that seemed to pulse from beneath their feet. It was faint but unmistakable, like the distant whir of heavy machinery. Jonah felt his chest tighten. The graveyard had never been so quiet, yet so alive with sound. "What could it be?" he asked, his voice low. Dahlia didn't answer immediately. She was focused on the waveforms displayed on her laptop, analyzing the patterns. After a moment, she tilted her head, the faintest glimmer of unease flickering in her expression. "It's too consistent," she said finally. "This isn't random. It's a machine, something moving, working. But why here? And why underground?" Jonah exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air. He looked around the graveyard, its rows of silent stones casting long shadows under the crescent moon. For the first time, he felt exposed, as if the darkness itself was watching. The next morning, their investigation took them to the city archives. The building was a relic from the town's early days, its shelves lined with dusty volumes and brittle papers. The air smelled faintly of mildew and ink. Dahlia dove into the records with practiced efficiency, combing through files marked with faded labels. Town infrastructure, Elmsworth Geological Survey, historical land use. Jonah followed her lead, though his unease lingered. "Got something?" Dahlia said after nearly an hour. She held up a map, its edges frayed with age. "Look here." Jonah leaned over the table, squinting at the intricate lines crisscrossing the paper. It was a map of the town's underground structures, sewers, storm drains, and something else. "Tunnels," Dahlia pointed out. Her finger traced a series of dashed lines labeled faintly as decommissioned access routes. Jonah frowned. What were they for? Looks like they're old, Dahlia said, flipping through the accompanying documents. Dates back to the late 1800s. Some of them were probably for moving goods when the railway was still active. But they've been closed for decades. Dahlia nodded. Officially, yeah. But look at this. She pointed to a small annotation near the cemetery. There's a notation here about a survey. Someone was poking around down there within the last few years. Jonah's unease deepened. The gravesite of Mr. Hawkins was positioned almost directly above one of the old tunnels. If someone had reactivated the tunnels, it could explain the machinery sounds, but it didn't explain why. That night, they returned to the graveyard, this time armed with a clearer purpose. The knowledge of the tunnels had changed the atmosphere. The ground beneath their feet no longer felt solid. Jonah's flashlight cut through the darkness as they approached the grave. He stopped short, his breath catching. The soil near Mr. Hawkins's tombstone had been disturbed. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Dahlia crouched beside the grave, her fingers brushing the loose dirt. The edges of the disturbed area were jagged and uneven, as if someone had hastily dug and then covered their tracks. "It's recent," she said, her voice tight. "This wasn't here yesterday." Jonah felt a wave of anger rise alongside his fear. Someone had been here, defiling sacred ground, for reasons he couldn't yet understand. "We're not alone in this," he said quietly, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Dahlia stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. Her expression was determined, her earlier skepticism now fully replaced by concern. "We need to find out what's down there," she said. Jonah nodded. They were past the point of turning back. Whatever was hidden beneath the surface of Albuquerque, it wasn't going to stay buried for long. Jonah adjusted his backpack as he and Dahlia stood at the edge of the old access point. The faint outline of the tunnel entrance loomed before them, its edges crumbled and overtaken by moss. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, and every instinct in Jonah's body told him to leave, go back to the safety of the church and let the dead rest. But he couldn't. Not now. Dahlia checked the flashlight in her hand, her expression sharp and unyielding. She didn't speak much, but her actions were decisive, each movement filled with a quiet determination. She handed Jonah a secondary light and pulled out her modified scanner. "This isn't just curiosity, you know," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low but firm. "If they've got equipment down there, it's because they're hiding something. Something big." Jonah nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter. His breath came slower, steadier, as they descended into the tunnel. The first steps were steep, their shoes crunching on loose debris that scattered with each movement. The farther they went, the thicker the silence became, punctuated only by the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere deep ahead. The tunnel opened into a narrow corridor, the walls uneven and slick with condensation. Dahlia's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing faintly visible tire tracks in the dirt. They were fresh, not yet smoothed by time or erosion. "They've been here recently," she muttered, kneeling to inspect the tracks. Her scanner beeped faintly, picking up weak electromagnetic signals, and whatever they're running, it's still active. Jonah felt his pulse quicken as his flashlight beam swept across the corridor. His eyes landed on something metallic lodged into the wall, small, almost unnoticeable. He approached cautiously, holding the light steady. "Is that a camera?" he asked. Dahlia stood and followed his gaze. Embedded in the wall was a discreet surveillance device, its lens faintly reflecting the light. She frowned, pulling out her scanner again. "They're watching the tunnel," she said, "and now they've seen us." Jonah's stomach tightened. Why monitor an abandoned tunnel? What could they possibly need to see down here? Dahlia didn't answer immediately. Her fingers danced over the scanner, her focus intense. After a moment, she exhaled. "This isn't just surveillance. It's linked to something above ground, probably near Hawkins's grave. They're tracking surface activity too. And that means we've been under surveillance," Jonah finished grimly. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. Whoever had placed these devices wasn't just monitoring the tunnel. They'd been watching the cemetery, watching them. They moved cautiously through the tunnel, the air growing colder with each step. The faint hum of machinery became more pronounced, a steady vibration that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Dahlia pointed ahead, her light catching on a cluster of equipment in a recessed alcove. Jonah followed, his heart pounding as they approached. The equipment was advanced, far beyond anything he expected to find in a forgotten tunnel. Large transmitters, signal boosters, and what looked like a makeshift server array were arranged meticulously, wires snaking across the dirt floor like veins. "This is high-grade stuff," Dahlia said, crouching beside the equipment. Her voice carried a mix of admiration and unease. "Whoever's running this isn't messing around. This isn't amateur work." Jonah glanced around, his unease growing. "Can you tell what it's for?" She adjusted the scanner, her brow furrowing. "It's broadcasting something. I can't decode it without more time, but it's data-heavy. They're pulling information from multiple points." "From the surface?" Dahlia nodded. "Probably. They're not just watching the grave, they're watching everything around it. Movement, sound, maybe even vibrations. It's like they're waiting for something to happen." A sound interrupted them, a faint but unmistakable echo of footsteps from deeper in the tunnel. Dahlia froze, her scanner going silent in her hand. Jonah turned his flashlight toward the sound, his grip tightening instinctively. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their silhouettes stark against the distant glow of more machinery. "Hide!" Dahlia hissed, pulling Jonah toward the alcove. They crouched behind the equipment, the cold metal pressing against their backs as the voices drew closer. The two men stopped near the surveillance setup, their voices low but agitated. "They're too close," one said, his tone sharp. "I told you we needed to pull out sooner." The other man replied, his voice steadier but no less tense. "We'll handle it. If they've seen anything, we'll know soon enough. Just make sure the surface team is ready to move the equipment." Jonah's pulse pounded in his ears as he strained to hear. He caught fragments, mentions of timelines, shipments, and something called the secondary site. Every word deepened his unease. The men lingered for a few minutes longer before turning back the way they came. Their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving Jonah and Dahlia in heavy silence. When they emerged from the tunnel, the night felt sharper, the air heavier. Jonah didn't speak as they crossed the cemetery, his thoughts racing. Back at the church, they unloaded their equipment in tense silence. It wasn't until Dahlia powered on her laptop and began reviewing the scanner's data that she broke the quiet. "They're moving their setup," she said, her voice grim. "We spooked them." "And they know we're involved," Jonah added. He leaned against the desk, his expression dark. "This isn't just about Mr. Hawkins anymore. It's bigger than we thought." Dahlia didn't look up from her screen. bigger and more dangerous. Jonah's grip on his coffee mug tightened as he sat across from Officer Dean Calloway, his old friend from seminary school who had traded sermons for a badge years ago. Dean had agreed to meet at the diner near the edge of town, neutral ground. The smell of bacon and old coffee filled the air, but neither man touched their food. "This isn't just idle curiosity, Dean," Jonah said, his voice low. "We found surveillance equipment in those tunnels. Advanced stuff. Someone's been watching the cemetery, and they know about us now." Dean leaned back in the booth, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. The years of police work had etched weariness into his face, but his mind was sharp. He didn't ask frivolous questions. He let Jonah's words settle before he spoke. "And you think these signals, this setup, is tied to something?" "Bigger?" Dean asked. Jonah nodded. "I don't know how big, but Dahlia's scans showed these signals aren't just random. They're deliberate, linked to something on the surface." Dean turned his attention to Dahlia, who sat quietly beside Jonah, a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Her youthful determination contrasted sharply with the priest's weathered faith. She tapped a few times on her phone before setting it down. "It's not just surveillance," Dahlia said. "The equipment's meant to monitor and transmit. Whoever set this up wasn't just looking for something. They were recording it, broadcasting it. And it's all too clean to be some amateur's operation." Dean rubbed his temples, his eyes darting toward the diner window. Outside, the sleepy town of Albuquerque carried on, oblivious to the shadows creeping beneath its streets. "I'll run what you've got," he said finally. "But if what you're saying is true, you're poking at something serious. It's not going to be easy to dig without drawing more attention." The following evening, Jonah and Dahlia sat in the rectory, the stillness of the church contrasting with the weight of Dean's findings. His call had come hours earlier, brief but loaded with implications. Dean had traced the serial numbers on some of the equipment they had photographed. The trail led to a shell company registered in a neighboring state, a name that meant nothing on paper but pointed to entities tied to international biomedical research. "Research," Dahlia said as she scrolled through pages of information on her laptop. "Or experimentation. These tunnels aren't just for moving stuff. They're conducting tests." Jonah's brow furrowed. "Tests on what? People? Animals? Who knows? Whatever it is, they're hiding it underground for a reason." Her words carried a grim certainty, and Jonah felt the familiar knot of unease in his stomach tighten. They decided to return to the cemetery that night, not for answers, but for evidence. If they could find more tangible proof, something physical, it might be enough to force a proper investigation. The air was heavy with the promise of rain as they made their way back to Mr. Hawkins's grave. Dahlia carried her gear, her every step deliberate. Jonah followed close behind, a flashlight in hand and a prayer in his heart. The earth near the grave looked undisturbed at first glance. But as Dahlia scanned the area, with a device she'd modified earlier, her expression shifted. "There's something here," she said, crouching down. Her scanner beeped faintly. Jonah knelt beside her, his flashlight illuminating the ground. As Dahlia dug carefully through the dirt, her fingers brushed against something stiff and unnatural. She pulled it free, a weathered envelope, its edges stained with soil but intact. She handed it to Jonah, who opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten but precise. The words chilled him. Phase 2 to commence. Reinforce access points. Maintain surveillance. Ensure shipment integrity through Albuquerque hub. Jonah's voice trembled as he read it aloud. What are they moving? What's Phase 2? Dahlia took the paper from him, her sharp eyes scanning it again. This is planning, she said. They're not just watching, they're building something, expanding it. The two exchanged a look, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them, like the weight of the night itself. Back at the rectory, Dahlia worked late into the night, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she pieced together the fragments of information they'd gathered. The tunnel map from the archives was spread across the table, lines drawn to indicate connections they hadn't noticed before. This, she said, pointing to a specific section of the map. This route here, it runs directly under the old distribution center on the east side of town. That's where they're funneling everything. Jonah peered over her shoulder. The same place that's been under investigation for suspected drug trafficking? Exactly, Dahlia said. And if that letter's anything to go by, it's not just drugs. They're moving something else, something they don't want anyone to find. Jonah rubbed his temples, the enormity of the conspiracy weighing on him. The cemetery, the tunnels, the surveillance, it all pointed to something larger, something sinister. We have to bring this to Dean, he said finally. He needs to know how deep this goes. Dahlia hesitated, her eyes lingering on the map. Do you trust him with this? If this company's as big as it seems, they'll have people everywhere, even in the Force. Jonah's faith in his old friend wavered for the first time, but before he could respond, Dahlia's laptop beeped, a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the quiet. She frowned, checking the screen. Something's triggering the sensors I set up near Hawkins's grave. What kind of something? Movement, she said. Big enough to trip the alarm. Jonah grabbed his coat, his resolve hardening. Then we don't have time to wait. Let's go. Jonah and Dahlia moved quickly through the dark streets of Albuquerque, the quiet town around them feeling like a stage for unseen eyes. Each step carried weight, as if the very air was charged with tension. The cemetery loomed ahead, its iron gates reflecting faint moonlight, and Dahlia kept glancing at her phone, tracking the motion sensor's data. Still active, she muttered. Her voice was calm but tight, her fingers flying across the screen. Jonah didn't respond. His mind was focused on the graveyard ahead, where the trail of their investigation seemed to deepen with every discovery. Whatever lay at the center of this mystery wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. And now it was moving. They slipped through the cemetery gates, the hinges creaking in protest. Dahlia adjusted her scanner, its faint beeping cutting through the stillness. They moved silently, weaving through rows of headstones until they reached the area near Mr. Hawkins's grave. Dahlia crouched, shining her flashlight over the disturbed earth. The dirt had been overturned again, fresher than before, the loose soil piled haphazardly, as if someone had been in a hurry. They've been here, she whispered. Her scanner beeped, the signal stronger now. Jonah glanced around, his flashlight sweeping over the surrounding headstones. And they're still close, he said quietly. Before Dahlia could respond, the faint sound of footsteps reached their ears. They froze, their breaths shallow as the sound grew louder. It was deliberate, steady, someone approaching. Dahlia turned off her flashlight, and they ducked behind a nearby mausoleum. From the shadows, they watched as two figures emerged from the darkness. Both men were dressed in dark clothes, their faces partially obscured by hats. One carried a heavy duffel bag, its contents clinking faintly with each step. "Do it fast," one of the men said, his voice low but firm. "We can't risk anyone seeing us again." The second man knelt near the disturbed grave, pulling out a small device that glinted in the faint light. Dahlia's grip on her scanner tightened as she watched, her breath barely audible. Jonah felt a surge of anger rise within him. These men had no respect for the dead, for the sanctity of this place, but he knew better than to act rashly. They needed more than confrontation. They needed proof. Dahlia's hand brushed against his arm, her silent signal to stay put. She adjusted her scanner, capturing the men's movements from their hiding spot. But then, as if sensing the weight of their gaze, one of the men stood abruptly, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his tone sharp. The other man paused, his hand still buried in the loose soil. "Hear what?" "Thought I heard something." He straightened, his posture tense. Jonah and Dahlia held their breath, the seconds stretching unbearably long. Finally, the first man shook his head, muttering something about being paranoid, and they returned to their task. When the men finally left, the tension in the air lingered. Jonah and Dahlia waited until the sound of their footsteps had faded completely before stepping out from their hiding spot. "What were they doing?" Jonah asked, his voice low but urgent. Dahlia didn't answer immediately. She approached the grave, scanning the disturbed soil with her device. Her face hardened as she read the data, and she crouched down to examine the area. "They planted something," she said, brushing the dirt aside to reveal a small metallic device buried just beneath the surface. Jonah knelt beside her, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" Dahlia shook her head, carefully extracting the device. It was small, rectangular and sleek, with faint lights blinking along its edge. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but it's transmitting something. They're monitoring this site, or maybe something below it." Jonah exhaled, his frustration mounting. "It's not enough to know what they're doing. We need to know why." The next morning, Dahlia worked tirelessly in the rectory, analyzing the device while Jonah prepared their findings to share with Dean. But before they could act, the first blow of retaliation landed, a front-page article in the Albuquerque Gazette. The headline read, "Local Priest's Crusade Disrupts Town Progress." Jonah stared at the paper, his stomach twisting. The article painted him as a meddlesome figure, using his position in the church to interfere with legitimate business developments. It accused him of rallying unfounded suspicions and destabilizing the town's economic future. "It's a hit piece," Dahlia said, her voice filled with quiet anger. She scrolled through her phone, finding similar stories popping up on local news sites. "They're trying to discredit us." Jonah set the paper down, his face pale but resolute. "They're scared," he said. "This means we're getting too close." But the smear campaign wasn't just about public perception. The fallout was immediate. Parishioners who had once trusted Jonah began withdrawing their support, and whispers of doubt spread through the community. Dahlia faced similar scrutiny, her online presence targeted with accusations of hacking and conspiracy. With no support left in Albuquerque, they turned their attention outward. Dahlia reached out to a national investigative journalist she had worked with briefly during college. Her contact agreed to review the evidence and consider running a story if they could provide something irrefutable. Jonah hesitated at first, reluctant to air the town's dirty secrets on such a large stage. But as the threats mounted, anonymous calls, shadowy figures lingering near the church, he realized they had no other choice. The journalist's report broke 3 days later, a damning expose linking the distribution center to illicit biomedicine and drug trafficking. The article detailed the surveillance equipment, the suspicious activities at the cemetery, and the ties to international corporations. The town of Albuquerque erupted in controversy, the once quiet streets filled with tension as outsiders turned their eyes toward the growing scandal. But with attention came danger, and Jonah and Dahlia found themselves more isolated than ever, their every move shadowed by unseen watchers. Jonah sat in the dim glow of the church office, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. The articles in the national press had turned the eyes of powerful men toward Albuquerque, and the ripple effects were already palpable. He could feel it in the wary glances of parishioners and in the way strangers lingered too long near the church's gates. Dahlia leaned against the doorway, her laptop balanced precariously in one hand. "They're not just watching anymore," she said, her voice low. "I caught a car parked near my place last night. Same one that circled the cemetery last week." Jonah exhaled, forcing himself to remain calm. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said, his tone firm. "But we have to keep going. If we stop now, they win." Dahlia nodded, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. "I've got something new," she said, crossing the room and setting her laptop on the desk. "There's a gala this weekend, some fundraiser hosted by the mayor. It's a front. Every major player in this mess is going to be there. If we can get in, we might find the link we've been looking for." Jonah frowned. The idea of stepping into the lion's den didn't sit well with him, but he knew she was right. This might be their only chance to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. The evening of the gala arrived with a sharp chill in the air. Jonah adjusted his collar nervously as they approached the grand hall, its windows glowing with warm light and its doors guarded by men in black suits. Dahlia had insisted on keeping their entry low-key, using forged invitations she'd managed to acquire through a contact. Inside, the room buzzed with polite conversation and the clinking of glasses. The town's elite mingled effortlessly, their laughter masking the undercurrent of tension that Jonah now recognized in every corner of Albuquerque. Dahlia's eyes darted around the room, cataloging faces with practiced efficiency. She nudged Jonah subtly, tilting her head toward a group gathered near the far end of the room. "There," she whispered. "That's one of the guys from the cemetery." Jonah followed her gaze, his stomach tightening as he recognized the man's face. He stood among a cluster of sharply dressed individuals, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. Nearby, the mayor chatted animatedly with another figure Jonah didn't recognize, a man with a cold, calculating demeanor that made his skin crawl. "They're too comfortable," Dahlia muttered. "They think this town is theirs." Jonah nodded, his jaw tightening. "Let's give them a reason to think otherwise." Over the next hour, they moved carefully through the crowd, blending into the background as Dahlia discreetly set up a hidden recording device near the main table. She worked quickly, her movements smooth and practiced, while Jonah played the role of an unassuming guest, striking up benign conversations and observing the room. Their patience was rewarded when the group of men near the table began speaking in hushed tones. Dahlia's earpiece crackled faintly as the recorder transmitted their words. "Everything's on track," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. "The shipments will go out as planned. The new testing site is secure." "What about the investigation?" another asked, his tone sharper. "Handled," came the reply. "The locals are too scared to push back and the feds don't have enough to go on. This town will stay quiet." Dahlia's expression darkened as she listened. "They're using Albuquerque as a testing ground," she said quietly, "for drugs, chemicals, whatever they're working on. And they think they're untouchable." Jonah clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Not for long," he said. When the event ended, they slipped out unnoticed, their recorder filled with damning evidence. Back at the rectory, Dahlia compiled the audio with their existing files, crafting a detailed report that outlined the connections between the local officials, the distribution center, and the international corporations funding the entire operation. The next morning, the report was sent to federal authorities. The wait that followed was agonizing, each passing day filled with uncertainty and a growing sense of danger. Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, their every move monitored by those who stood to lose the most. Then, the response came. A team of federal agents arrived in Albuquerque, their presence unmistakable as they began questioning officials and searching key locations. The news spread quickly, and the town erupted in chaos. Arrests followed in rapid succession. The mayor was among the first to be taken into custody, his connections to the illicit operations laid bare. Other prominent figures soon followed, their carefully constructed facades crumbling under the weight of the evidence. The story broke nationwide, headlines declaring the fall of a corrupt network that had exploited a small town for profit and power. Protests erupted across the country, the public outraged by the revelations of unethical experiments and illegal trafficking. The aftermath unfolded slowly, like the steady unraveling of an intricate tapestry. Albuquerque, once a quiet and forgotten town, now found itself at the center of a national reckoning. The streets buzzed with reporters, cameras capturing every angle of a story that had gripped the country's attention. For Father Jonah and Dahlia, the weight of their actions settled heavily upon them, even amidst the victories. The arrests had come swiftly after the federal investigation began. Each new name in the headlines carried greater shock than the last. The mayor, whose silver tongue had won him re-election time and again, was revealed as the linchpin of the local operation. His connections to the distribution center and the clandestine experiments ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. Then came the revelation that chilled Jonah to the core. A high-ranking government official had been orchestrating the entire operation from the shadows. The official's influence had stretched far beyond Albuquerque, linking the local corruption to a vast network of international deals. It wasn't just about profit, it was about power. Dahlia sat at the rectory desk, scrolling through articles as the names and faces of those involved flashed across her screen. "It's like a hydra," she muttered. "Cut off one head and two more take its place." Jonah, seated across from her, rubbed his temples. "At least we've exposed this part of it," he said. "The tunnels are being dismantled, the town's under federal oversight. It's a start." Dahlia nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Do you think they'll really clean it up? Or is this just the surface getting scrubbed while the deeper mess stays hidden?" Jonah didn't answer immediately. He stared at the crucifix on the wall, its silent presence a reminder of his faith in justice, both divine and human. But even faith had its limits, and doubt lingered at the edges of his thoughts. Over the next few weeks, the dismantling of the operation consumed Albuquerque. The tunnels beneath the cemetery were sealed, their entrances collapsed under the watchful eyes of federal agents. The distribution center was raided, its shelves of illicit materials confiscated and catalogued as evidence. Dahlia accompanied Jonah to one of the final inspections of the cemetery. It felt oddly quiet without the hum of surveillance equipment or the lingering presence of those who had operated in the shadows. As they stood near Mr. Hawkins's grave, now undisturbed, Jonah let out a heavy breath. "It's strange," he said. "To think all this started with a camera in a coffin." Dahlia smirked, though her gaze was distant. "If you'd told me a few months ago I'd be crawling through tunnels and exposing government corruption with a priest, I'd have laughed in your face." Jonah chuckled, the sound light in the stillness. And if you'd told me I'd be relying on a tech-savvy skeptic to bring justice to a town, I might have done the same. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey pressing lightly between them. In the days that followed, the people of Albuquerque began to rebuild. The stories of Jonah and Dahlia's courage spread, painting them as unlikely heroes who had risked everything to expose the truth. Some called it divine intervention, others chalked it up to sheer determination. For Jonah, the recognition was both humbling and uncomfortable. He had never sought the spotlight, and now, as people approached him with gratitude and admiration, he found himself yearning for the quiet simplicity of his pastoral duties. Dahlia, too, struggled to adjust. Her name appeared in articles, her face on news segments. It was surreal, the kind of attention she had never sought. But amidst the praise came the darker reminders, anonymous threats, whispers of retribution from those who had lost everything because of her actions. "You know they'll try again," she said one evening, her voice heavy with certainty. "Maybe not here, maybe not now, but they'll regroup, find another place to set up shop." Jonah nodded. "They might, but so will people like us." Dahlia raised an eyebrow. "You planning to become some kind of vigilante priest?" He smiled faintly. "No, but I've learned that sometimes faith means more than prayer. Sometimes it means action. And if the time comes again..." He didn't finish the thought, but Dahlia understood. Weeks turned into months, and life in Albuquerque began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after such upheaval. The reporters left, the federal agents moved on, and the town tried to reclaim its identity. Jonah returned to his sermons, his words carrying a deeper weight now. He spoke of courage, of standing against the darkness, of finding hope even in the face of overwhelming odds. His congregation listened, their respect for him etched in every nod and murmur of agreement. Dahlia resumed her studies, though her time in Albuquerque had left a permanent mark on her. She found herself more vigilant, more aware of the hidden forces that shaped the world. She stayed in touch with Jonah, their bond forged in the crucible of their shared battle. As the seasons changed and the shadows of the past began to fade, both Jonah and Dahlia knew that their story wasn't truly over. The fight against corruption, against greed and power, was never ending. But for now, they had done their part. For now, Albuquerque could rest. The story of Jonah and Dahlia is a riveting tale of courage, perseverance, and the unwavering pursuit of truth in the face of overwhelming darkness. Their journey from quiet investigators to catalysts of justice reflects the profound strength found in moral conviction and personal sacrifice. Jonah, a man of faith, embodies the resilience required to challenge not just corruption, but the complacency of those around him. His role as a priest adds a layer of complexity as he navigates the delicate balance between his spiritual duties and his fight for justice. Dahlia, with her sharp intellect and fiery determination, complements Jonah's moral compass, showing the power of combining skill with purpose. Together, they highlight the importance of teamwork and trust in overcoming insurmountable odds. The narrative emphasizes that evil often thrives in shadows, not because it is unstoppable, but because too few are willing to confront it. The lesson is clear. Silence and apathy allow darkness to grow, but courage and unity can expose and dismantle it. At its heart, this story is a tribute to those who refuse to turn away, even when the cost is great. It reminds us that justice is not inevitable. It must be fought for, even when the world seems to conspire against it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.